Cheers. I want to speak a bit today on Greater Lebanon, Lebanon in its current configuration, what was created in 1920 as Greater Lebanon, and the error of Greater Lebanon as a unitary state. On this eve, just barely a few days before September 1st, 2020, which will mark the 100th anniversary of the establishment, some say the resurrection or the revival of Greater Lebanon, the Lebanese Republic seems to be teetering on the brink of dissolution. Now, whatever semantics describing the current tribulations of modern Lebanon, usually using such terms as collapse or dismantlement or disintegration and such like, it is clear to anyone familiar with the state's modern history that what the Lebanese are living today are most probably the death throes of their unitary republic, the failure of the unitary state that some Maronites insisted on in 1920, and the beginning perhaps of something else emerging in the place of this unitary constitutional republics. Now, I want to be clear here that this is in no way a death knell, if you will. It's not a voice of doom. I believe there will always be a Lebanon, and that indeed the modern Lebanese are going through perhaps growing pains today. They're going through the natural process in the life of nations, part of the process of trials and errors and tribulations that accompany any exercise in national building. And a reminder that none of the states of the place we call today the Middle East existed before 1918, 1920, and none, or I would say perhaps a few, may still continue to exist in the years and decades to come. Iraq and Syria being the most salient immediate examples of modern Middle Eastern states on the road to perdition. Furthermore, none of the modern states of the Middle East had a raison d'être or a historical depth, for that matter, to warrant those states coming into being in the first place, with the exception of a few, namely Lebanon perhaps, which had historical precedents in the days of the Imara Principality of Fakhreddin in the 17th century, and in successor formations, in successor entities, namely the autonomous province of 1860, which was guaranteed by a concert of European powers, and of which modern Lebanon, to a large extent, is an outgrowth of. And so, again, with the exception of Lebanon, many of the modern states of the Middle East were, in fact, European inventions, not to say European impositions, down to their very national names and demonyms. Places like Jordan and Syria and Palestine, for instance, are a reflection of European, not local, and certainly not Arab geography and toponymy and taxonomy. And again, with the exception of Lebanon being the only local spawn of a local history, or rather perhaps a local historiography, the only modern state with some historical depth, and certainly with a local people, namely the Maronites, possessing a fierce, zealous sense of self-awareness and a distinct, as a distinct people, and in their case imposing on a European superpower, France in this case, imposing on France their own national vision and national will. In any case, whatever may come to replace the Lebanon of 1920 is anyone's guess, whether it be a Lebanese federation, an Islamic republic, a slave republic, wholly and openly subservient to Iran, as is the case today, or a rump Lebanese state with reduced territory, uneasily coexisting alongside other Sowetos, subservient to Iran, Syria, Israel, or the Palestinians. Whatever may come, the Lebanese Republic as we know it today, or as we have come to see it since 1920, has all but ceased to exist. And short of an internationally guaranteed regime, similar to the one imposed in 1860 by a concert of European powers, a regime that would salvage what is left of the Lebanese entity, remove the specter of Hezbollah domination, and restore state sovereignty. Anything short of that, the Lebanese ought to be realistic and reasonable and begin emotionally detaching, not to say begin detoxing from the 1920 exercise, the 1920 model of this unitary state. Now, as a student of history, I try as much as possible to steer clear of making predictions. And I learned this very early on in my student years from a prominent Lebanese historian with a fiendish, wry, Oxfordian wit, a man by the name of Charles Isawi, who famously said, "As a historian, I never make predictions, especially about the future." Get it? Need a few minutes? Okay. I never made predictions, especially about the future. So anyway, in Isawi's tradition, what I'll try to do briefly today, I know I said briefly like, 10 minutes earlier, so I'll try to be brief. I'm going to introduce a couple of historical texts in order to hopefully help illuminate the times at hand. Facts and examples from texts I dug up in the past couple of days, from notes that I have from archival readings. Fact or example number one, for instance, is that modern Lebanon was established in 1920 in spite of France, the colonial power, not with its support, and certainly not with its ready blessings, even though the declaration was made on September 1st, 1920 by General Gouraud in the name of the French Republic. So that's fact number one. Fact number two, the overwhelming majority of the Maronite intelligentsia at the time was in favor of a smaller Lebanon, not Greater Lebanon. That even in 1921, the French also were still seriously considering deferring to the Maronite advocates of Petit Liban before deferring to those who wanted Grand Liban. And at the head of the advocates of Petit Liban was the party of Émile Eddé. Opposed to it would later come to be known as the party of Bshar al-Khouri. The party of Émile Eddé actually proposed to cede the eastern Bekaa Valley and Tripoli to the states of Damascus and Aleppo. And indeed, in 1925, Henri de Jouvenel, the first civilian French High Commissioner, who I think came after Gouraud, or there was somebody, don't quote me on that, but de Jouvenel was the first French High Commissioner who did not issue from a military background. He was a civilian. And he worked very hard for a few months in 1925 on ending France's role as mandatory overseer. And he worked also with the Quai d'Orsay on trying to effectuate the transfer of Tripoli and the Bekaa to a Syrian federation that he was planning. So not only ceding them now to the state of Damascus and the state of Aleppo, but they were also working, the Quai d'Orsay was working on creating a Syrian federation. He failed, and he was eventually recalled to Paris in September of 1926. He was replaced by another Henry. His name was Ponceau, Henri Ponceau at the time, who also tried to continue pursuing the same policy of disengagement from the Levant and the reduction of Lebanon's frontiers. So 1920 Lebanon was not final in its current frontier, so there was still talk about changing it. And indeed, the Émile Idde party would still pursue this into the 1930s. 1936, for instance, this Petit Liban vision was still very present in Émile Idde's thinking and in his international connections, and he would famously, in a much anthologized anecdote, he would try to convince Chaim Weizmann, who was at the time representative of the Jewish agency in the Yishuv, the pre-state Jewish community. He was trying in a meeting, tried to convince him to annex the regions of Tyre to the future Jewish state. Now, Weizmann, for those of you who don't know, his full name was Dr. Chaim Weizmann. He was a trained chemist with an eye to testing ingredients and wary of explosive substances. And if you read into 2020, you'll know why Weizmann would have provided an answer like this. He was a visionary as Idde was, because Idde was not, out of the goodness of his heart offering these territories. He had vision. He knew why he wanted to reduce Greater Lebanon to smaller Lebanon. So Weizmann famously answers Idde, who offered that booby-trapped gift, and told him, quote, Chaim Weizmann would tell Idde, my grandfather always told me to never accept a gift that eats. So there you have it. I suggest both Idde and Weizmann were in 1936 very shrewdly reading into 2020. And so at every turn, and with every suggestion for a reduced Lebanon, a reversion to Petit Liban, the Maronite establishment, at its head, Patriarch Hoyek, at every turn he insisted on Lebanon's, what he called, natural and historical frontiers, and on maintaining Grand Liban. Another fact also that you may be able to tie into present times is that Maronite factionalism was as prevalent in 1920 as it is today in 2020. The advocates of Petit Liban, on the one hand, I think read history in the longue durée. They saw historical events in the long term, extending over centuries, if not millennia. And they peered through the importance of not only historical, economic, political, and social events and changes, but also in terms of geographic, geological, and even climatic events and changes. That's why smaller Lebanon, where the Maronites would remain a majority, was a more secure arrangement for them than Greater Lebanon, where the Maronites' numbers and vision may be diluted with perhaps noxious national ideas. This is on one hand. On the other hand, the advocates of Grand Liban had only the immediate past in their rear-view mirror, and that's fair. That's warranted, I think. Namely, they had in their rear-view mirror the famines of the Great War, and they could not fathom of a Lebanon that would be landlocked, isolated in a mountain sanctuary, deprived of the Bekaa Valley, which fed the entire Roman Empire. The nickname of the Bekaa Valley was the granary of Rome. So they could not fathom of a Lebanon without this bread basket, and they could not fathom of a Lebanon without the Mediterranean seaports, the lungs of Mount Lebanon, if you will, and its pathway to Europe. And therefore, they could not fathom of a landlocked state that would be easy prey to starvation and death. But that was 1920. Okay, landlocked states were still scary then. The image of a prosperous, peaceful Switzerland was perhaps not readily available in the minds of the patriarch and others. Only memories of starvation on Mount Lebanon were, and I'm going to read you a brief text from Charles Corm's description of the scenes of starvation on Mount Lebanon and in Beirut as the dead and dying were descending from Mount Lebanon to reach Beirut and to perhaps find a scrap of food. One text reads, I'm hungry, I'm hungry, I'm hungry. Shrunken and shriveled skeletons, bellies up atop heaps of city garbage dumps, unable to move even to beg for a scrap of food, could still be heard beseeching passers-by for help, for a crumb of bread. Utterly reduced to an abominable skeletal state, passed out as if entranced by the stench of the vermin emanating from their own decomposing bodies, excreting this god-awful, hideous, hallucinating smell that seems to imbibe this city by day and by night. Some, having already succumbed to their bodies and their souls' devastation, seemed to have beforehand spat up their entrails, dragging them behind them in the filth and the dust of the city streets before collapsing atop the municipal garbage dump, their last hope for a scrap of food. Bellies swelled up by putrid gases, sheared, shriveled, and perforated skins, monstrous, gory human waste, feculent and turbid wounds, tortured and gnarled by famine, expired souls, ambulant cadavers, wholesale mass despair. That, my friend, is in brief what had become of the best, the healthiest, the purest, the strongest, the most gentle, the most beautiful, benign, noble, and brave from among the peoples of this assassinated mountain. End quote. And so the Maronite establishment wouldn't hear of a smaller Lebanon with this image as backdrop, if you will. Even in September 21st, okay, this is exactly September 27th today, to the day, 99 years ago. September 27th, 1921, barely a year after the establishment of Greater Lebanon, Gouraud was discussing with the Quai d'Orsay the possibility of, again, ceding Tripoli and the eastern Bekaa Valley to Damascus. Patriarch Houayik invited Gouraud to his summer residence in Diman, and, you know, I'm going to read you bits of a text, and I would imagine essentially to entrap him, to say, hey, dude, what are you doing? Okay, so here's the gist of how the Patriarch essentially lectured the High Commissioner. Lectured is nice. Basically gave him a whipping, a public whipping, presumably after a few drinks. Now, not that he needed that social lubricant. Houayik was legendary for his brassiness. So here's what he tells. It's from this description that Joseph Sauda gives of this, because Joseph Sauda was at the time the secretary of Houayik, and is go-between between Houayik, between the Patriarchate and the Quai d'Orsay. So this story is again culled from the archives, but it's told through the pen of Yusuf Hawayik. And he says that this speech, this whipping, if you will, was said extemporaneously. So after lunch, the patriarch stood up and said, "Mon général, that's what I want to tell you." So here's a short excerpt. He says, "Mon général, it is inadmissible for us, 60 years after 1860, to go full circle and return back to 1860. It is precisely to prevent this eventuality," basically 1860, the reduction of Lebanon to a smaller Lebanon. So it is precisely this eventuality that 2 years ago, as you know, it is precisely because of this that 2 years, as you know, I addressed the peace conference in Paris. Should Lebanon's independence and integrity of its territory run the risk of disintegration today on your watch, I am prepared, even in my old age and despite the exhaustion ravaging my body, I am prepared to go back to Paris and remain there until I receive the formal written promise of Lebanon's irrevocable, final, definitive, and complete independence in its natural historical frontiers. Mon général, we trust you, we trust France, but Lebanon's independence and the integrity of its historical natural frontiers are off limits, and you shall have a rebellion on your hands should anyone dare fiddle with the integrity of Lebanon." End quote. It was much longer than that, and the description is really, General Gouraud was taken aback. He does defend himself, but he stands up and gives a counter speech defending himself. But he says that that France will always protect Lebanon's territorial integrity. So basically, he kind of walks back what he was attempting to do, and that is going back to Petit Liban. And so this is to tell you that it was finally the Maronite Patriarchate that imposed its will, putting in place a Greater Lebanon, but a neutral Lebanon. This is a very important caveat. A neutral Lebanon, a federative Lebanon, a democratic political system. Indeed, the 1926 Constitution, if you go back to it and read it, the 1926 Constitution of Lebanon is a federative constitution with a bicameral assembly where there was a powerful Senate that ruled. So the power was concentrated in the Senate. So whatever goes up to the Senate and the Senate does not resolve has to go back down the echelon to the drawing table. Unfortunately, it was the Bashar al-Khoury party that abrogated the Senate, beginning in 1927, concentrated the executive in the presidency rather than the Senate, concocted this duplicitous national pact, and the rest, as they say, was a downhill spiral. Add to that the fact that Lebanon's modern history is often written based on Bashar al-Khoury's autobiography, Haqa'iq Lubnaniya. Those of you who need Arabic, became the most quoted source on this topic, and probably the most tendentious. The reality remains that 1926 was the most wholesome, most complete possible constitution for a divided society like Lebanon. Lebanon is a divided, heterogeneous society that can no longer afford the deception of the national pact, nor the luxury of the fictionalized history as dictated by the Khoury party. the advocacy for Lebanon's positive neutrality. I think Patriarch Rai's phrase is active neutrality, as he elaborated a few days ago and announced it earlier in his August 5th homily. This advocacy for positive neutrality or active neutrality proceeds from my readings of the past few days. I think it proceeds from a profoundly learned reading of 1920, 1926, 1927, and their aftermath. Thanks for lending me your attention, and until next time. Ciao.